only mode.
Thank you for joining us today. This is Firestorm. My name is Bill Baker, and we're pleased to welcome you to this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about data breach escalation. This is part of the business crisis risk scenario. We invite you to become our friend at Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, and you can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Solo. We have two hashtags for this session. One is Crisis Coach. The other is Biz Crisis Risk. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Keep in mind, the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product provided by Firestorm should be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel, and this information should not be considered or interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We have two presenters today, the president of Firestorm, Jim Satterfield, and the managing director of the business crisis practice here at Firestorm, Jack Healy. Jim, over to you, please.
Thanks, Bill. We appreciate it, and for pulling together today's webinar, and we appreciate everyone that's in attendance. Today we're going to be focusing on business crisis risk around a cyber breach and cyber risk as we're focused here today. Up on your screen you'll see, can you identify your organization's next crisis? And we can, but more importantly, can you? And today we want to give you some of the reasons why this is a particular exposure and some of the warning signs to begin to look for and identify in that particular area. Jack Healy and I have been having a conversation on the subject for a few days as we've been looking at a variety of groups, and one of the things that Jack pointed out that I thought was very interesting, this has been a subject in the fraud sector for an awful long time. If we turn the clock back in time, people would break in and steal intellectual property and data and information, the filing cabinets and the files, and take that information out. We just are now moving and putting all this in the cloud so that it's more available to anyone at any time. And as we think about that, we want to give you some points today that I think you'll find it interesting as we continue the discussion. So, Jack, as you pointed out, it's a risk issue, not an IT issue. Do you want to clarify that some?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, cyber security is part of the business crisis risk. It's just like any other risk that your business will face. However, the tools, of course, that you use to combat it, some are IT, but most of them are human resource compliance and process related. You know, most of the breaches that have come about have been a result of, you know, people not following these protocols. And that's pretty important to understand that you can put everything in place, but people will still click the wrong click. They'll share passwords, they'll answer an email, they'll click on the Wells Fargo link, they'll do all sorts of things. And the more valuable the information that your organization has, the more sophisticated somebody will use to go after it. But you need to have sophisticated defenses, because a threat will not occur. They won't go after you with a sophisticated breach if your defenses aren't sophisticated. So that's why you see the more sophisticated companies, the breachers go about it in a different way. So part of this is also understanding what your crown jewels are. What is the data that you have, and what is somebody going to do to go after it, and why? And, you know, as the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, have counseled, you know, every senior management and board has to have the situational awareness. They have to understand the strategy and operations, and it has to have an incident response plan. And Jim, that's what we're going to cover today. I think as we go through this slide will appear again at the end, but this is really what people need to focus on, and this is what they're going to learn in this webinar.
And for those of you that are in the business continuity area that are on our call today, what we're seeing is that's an underlying requirement, but also it's an expansion of business continuity to include this. Falsely, companies have viewed this solely as an IT problem, and it's a business problem, and that's the emphasis that we want to share with you today and we're going to give you some more insights associated with it. Our Chief Information Security Officer created this slide for our presentation just a couple of weeks ago. And when you look at the 1 billion electronic records that have been breached and reported in the media over the last year, that's a number that's just staggering to think about that many elements and coming back out. And what we want to do is to get under the cover and look and see what that 1 billion really means and what the impacts would be associated with it. 62% of the companies that have been breached learned about the breach from its customers. One of the cycles that we'll talk about is that you learn of the breach on average 240 days after it occurred. Think about an analogy. Let's assume that in your house you've got a kitchen sink, and that kitchen sink starts to leak, and it leaks heavily for 240 days before you become aware of it. Think about the damage that would occur into your home. The fact that a customer is coming forward and the customer estimate is your quality assurance and quality control department, you're certainly adversely affected. 42% of those that have been hacked lack the budget and personnel to effectively detect and prevent breaches. If somebody else is telling you, you didn't detect it, CISO did this in an analysis through the process.
I wonder, Jim, how much of that is just trying to throw money at the problem, though. So they ask, do you have enough budget? And the question is, what is enough budget? You know, how many firewalls do you need? And I wonder how much of that really is just a reaction to the fact that the CISO is the one that management turns to first, because management many times use this as an IT issue, and they turn to them, and if I only had more money, which seems to be the issue.
And the CISO here, we're talking about the Chief Information Security Officer,
yes.
As we talked through. 70% of all retailers say that they've been breached. Think about that number for a minute of all the retailers that are out, and we clearly know the Target story and Home Depot and others, but and the reason why that's being breached is that's where the money is. That's where, like the banks with the bank robber, drawing that analogy. 57% of the retailers said a supplier was liable for the breach. Who else has access into your information? And it's interesting, the parallel here in the largest common failure in a disaster or crisis is supply chain failure. So this is just another version of supply chain failure coming to within your organization. The last one is the one that just completely blew my mind when I saw it, that 2 out of the 3 victims of identity theft are informed of the breach and did nothing about it. It's telling you that you've got a problem, and 2 out of 3 people don't do anything about the problem that they've been told that they have. What was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I was somewhat surprised, especially seeing how most of the companies, when they notify them, and many people on the call today, including myself, received a nice message when Blue Cross Blue Shield was hacked. And what's interesting, we had 4 people in our family on the policy. 2 of us have received the notification, and 2 have not. I have to believe those data files were together. But they say, look, we'll supply free credit monitoring. And in fact, I've had credit monitoring for a dozen years, and the first breach happened when the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants lost a laptop with everybody's social security number on it 12 years ago, and that was my introduction to having my data breached.
It's good to be an early adopter, Jack. I think that's a good.
I thought ironic that the accountants were the first ones I heard.
When you look at the numbers here, and we won't read them all, you can see that. One of the things in pulling this together, the mega breaches aren't included in these average numbers. If they were, they would even be higher in looking at those areas.
What do you mean by a mega breach, Jim?
Well, first of all, it's my definition of major surgery, any surgery that happens to me. But in this case, like Target event would be an example specifically that's not included here. But when you look at this, and there's that 240 days of notification, how many records are involved, the breach cost, and the average lost business costs are shown associated with that and where the targets would be. As we move on, each stolen record, and you'll start to see these that are listed, what the costs are around those particular ones, and then a couple of things you can do to mitigate that. And that's an important element to go, that there are steps, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that today.
But if you look at it, it's $201 per record, but that increases if it was a device that was stolen. It also increases if you have a third party. The interesting one is quick notification. If you notice, the cost of a breach goes up per record with quick notification, and that's because, according to Ponemon, that the quicker somebody responds, the less information they know, and the more they react in the wrong way. So they actually spend money, time, and effort in the wrong direction because they don't have their handle on what the breach is. It's the, we'll just do something.
Well, and that's consistent with our crisis management experience. Most everything you learn initially in a crisis is wrong. If you're trying to go out and, quote, get ahead of this crisis, get the information out, and you're circulating wrong information where you're saying this didn't happen, and it turns out, in fact, it did, that's why you're seeing those costs go up associated with it. And by not having the plans in advance, not knowing what your messages are, what you're going to communicate, that makes a significant difference. Anything else before we move on?
Well, just if you highlight the incident response plan, that's the biggest, that's a large cost reduction. If you actually have a plan in place that you know you're going to go after, you know, certainly having a CISO, and the strong security posture has to do with your IT platform, and have you actually had it tested by a third party to try to breach your system? And, you know, I just remember I wrote a blog on Firestorm about healthcare.gov and how they had experts on there telling them all the time that it was very easily breached, and they went ahead anyway. And then those same people came back to Congress. They testified that it is still quite breachable. And, you know, and they said, well, you know, we haven't been breached yet. And they said, well, you don't even have the software in place to tell if you have been breached. So things that you can do to monitor whether or not you have been breached, are, of course, put up the robust defenses, but you should have your system tested.
So what should you know? We've certainly said a bunch of times that this is not an IT problem, it's a human problem. We always talk about a crisis, every crisis being a human crisis, and there we're focused on the impacts and what does it mean. Here we're actually focusing on the fact that it could be caused from that perspective, and that's important to know within the element that that's an area for us to be thinking about. There's a term that we hear a lot called picnic, problem in chair, not in computer. That's what the picnic acronym stands for, because it's that human area. It's the clicking on that link in the email that you shouldn't have. It's opening that other thing up that would come. The crown jewels that you talked about earlier, know what data you have, who would want it, how to protect it, and what to do if you lose it.
And it's not just the crown jewels. It's the protected healthcare information that you hold on your associates. It's the personal identifiable information that you have on your associates and your customers. And although they've passed laws to make these, you know, they say, well, this is what you have to do, it's still accessible. And think about how many third parties have access to it. Think about how many flat files that you're sending to your healthcare provider or your payroll company or your EAS provider.
So as we think about it, you need a plan associated with it. How do we know that it's happening? What are we going to do? What are we going to say? And that's where the last three bullets on the slide come through, to train the organization to recognize those indicators that could be the early signals that we would see, test the plans, test the plans, test the plans, and then establish this intelligence network that's funneling you the information that you need at every step along the way.
That probably helps the intelligence network if 65% of the folks breached hear about it from their customers. It's probably good to see that ahead of time.
And when people know about things, they talk about it, and today they talk about it on social media. So many times that's where we're going to learn that we already have a problem and that others are aware of it. So a predict, plan, perform process. If we apply that again into cyber risk and data breach, it's to predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are. What are their impacts? To understand if this is taken, what is that going to mean to our business, to our customers, to our employees? How do we monitor for it? What are the triggers that would activate our plans associated with it? The plans are not how we will run our business if we lose access to that information. The plans are how will we protect our clients or those that have had the information taken. What are we going to say? That's a part of our plan. Who's going to deliver the message, the medium at which we're going to go through it, and to carry forward, and then obviously the execution of it, the training, the testing, the exercising, the monitoring, and then the responding into the crisis. So following that structure, just as we would on a business continuity plan or workplace violence, applies exactly the same as we think about a cyber risk. So let's talk a little bit about cyber risk in particular. Jack?
You know, the cyber risk just really amounts to fraud. It's the same thing that we've been studying. I'm a certified fraud examiner, and you know, I think I came home 15 years ago and declared to my family that I wasn't going to bank online. That because the only fraud examiners, and to this day, the only ones that do, bank with a dedicated PC that they don't use for anything except to bank. It's the safest way to do it. So this has been around for a while, and the motivators, tools, and tactics that they use are the same ones that fraudsters have used for decades. They just have a new tool. And that's why the business crisis risk model that we've developed will handle this. It's the same type of process that you go through to predict it's going to come, plan for it, and then recognize it, and that's where we get into the indicators and why that's important. I say the good news is that the tactics will always equal the defenses. That's what I was talking about before. You know, banks have very robust defenses, and therefore the fraudsters have to use different avenues. There's one breach where they actually got into a company by hacking into the Chinese restaurant that the company used to use to order their food, and they sent through a Trojan horse with a file with their new menu and price update back to the client. The client opened it up, and that's how they got into the system, because they had robust systems. The bad news is, no matter how good your system is, the human element's always going to be in there, and I have to tell you that it's usually senior management. Many, many times it is senior management that allows them in the door.
Okay, we're canceling lunches at Firestorm. We can't do that anymore. That's going to be a factor for us as we move forward. Okay, so that comes back to this thing about so the threats are really from the inside?
Yeah, most breaches occur from the inside, and probably the biggest breach that's occurred most recently has been the Sony breach. And although the North Koreans were in there, I've attended a few conferences since then, and a number of the major security firms who are familiar with it advocate that Sony was most likely an inside job. And they've said, well, which is the better story to hear from your U.S. government? Is it that every single organization in the United States is susceptible to a former employee coming back and stealing your intellectual property, or a foreign national government did it and we need more money for NSA to prevent it? And the truth is, most of it is from an inside job. So it comes down to the two questions. You know, what information and secrets are you protecting, and who are the actors that want them? And knowing that before it occurs is the way that you fight this.
So a homework assignment, if you're listening to the webinar today, is to have you identified what that information is within your organization. If you think of it as part of your business impact analysis that you did in your business continuity process, that's a great place to start to come back in. Once we understand the information and secrets that we're protecting, then we can figure out, why would somebody want it? Is it a competitor? Is it a way to defraud? Is it another aspect? Those elements will come into place. But the first step is you've got to understand what you have and you're carrying forward. Now, there's a quote here.
I love this quote. Cybersecurity is not an IT problem, but a psychological problem. You have to understand your adversaries. That came from the head of cyber intelligence at Deloitte. And the first Big Four accountant I've ever seen, by the way, that was wearing blue jeans and a pullover shirt when he spoke. The point there is that you really need to understand what people are after, and they're criminals, they're crooks. So when you had a bookkeeper, they're going to have access to your cash. And their method to do it is they're going to play with the numbers in the books. If you have a salesman that's cheating on a sales report or getting kickbacks, well, his target of opportunity is customers and the expense report. You need to understand who's after the data that you have and what tools and methodologies they're going to use to go after them.
So I think you've opened the door now to start to think about what data that we're concerned about. Obviously, the intellectual property, and the term of art here is the crown jewels that we're protecting. It's the most critical asset. And the statistic today is that 80% of the assets of companies are in the information and intelligence side of the house, as opposed to the old physical assets, the steel mill, the physical plant. It's the intellectual property that defines who your company is.
You know, a good example of that is the Russians actually had developed their own version of the space shuttle. It only flew once, and I think it did a half dozen orbits, and it was during the Gorbachev era. But I saw a picture the other day of that space shuttle, and it was just remarkable how it was a carbon copy of our space shuttle. One has to think that our crown jewels for that were stolen, and I think there was a picture last year, the Chinese, their latest fighter jet, and it was identical to one of our jets that's 1 or 2 models removed. So this goes on all the time between nation states. It also goes on between companies. You read all the time about patent infringement, or most recently, you know, where some employee leaves to go to a new company, and that company realizes that they actually took intellectual property with them, and they go back to their former employer and say, hey, you know, we have this information. So you have to be wary of what they're going to take.
Well, and now you see on the screen the personal identifiable information, PII, and protected healthcare information, PHI. Those are the terms and the acronyms that you're going to see. But I want to point out to everyone, look how much more valuable the healthcare information is. And that the breach that you referred to coming out of Blue Cross Blue Shield certainly exemplified that.
Yeah, and the reason for that is healthcare information normally is bundled. So you get the name, address, social security number, names of next of kin. You get a lot of information in that one load. The more information a fraudster has, the easier it is for them to either make fake identities, fake credit cards, or in this case, execute healthcare fraud. What was interesting is that higher dollar amount of $125 actually is what a U.S. record is worth in Turkey. And apparently the organized crime groups in Turkey use this to execute healthcare fraud all over the world.
So I now have a new revenue plan then. Just go to Turkey and sell that out. So we know it's bad. In fact, we could eliminate the first part of the webinar and just said data breach is bad. Cyber risk is bad. So what do we do?
Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to have a good process and controls. You know, you need to know that it's occurring. You have to have an internal monitoring and process and access. And we're going to go through, we have a list of indicators later on in this that talk about it, but obviously if you see HR downloading a 1 terabyte file, which includes all your customers and all other things, you would want a system in place that would flag that you know, human resources should not be having that information. You need to identify all the software and devices. The bring your own device craze. You know, there are some businesses that will limit what you can bring, but many of them to reduce costs said, oh, you can bring your own device. Well, you can't control the apps that are on that, and you can't control where that's going, and that has been a huge access breach. And then unauthorized devices and software. So even if you do control it, people who download software, do you have the ability to stop that? I know when I was CFO of a company, we actually would have software that was out there, and we'd be scanning laptops. And if you had the wrong software on there or one we didn't like, we would actually shut down your laptop remotely and tell you could not access our system until you remove that software. But everybody agrees that, you know, we're all being hacked, and there's not a lot you can do about it except, you know, be ready for it and not be in disaster denial.
Well, that's the director of the FBI's quote. There are two kinds of companies, those that know that they have been hacked and those that have been hacked and don't yet know it. And with the 240-day lag time, you can certainly see how that would occur.
And to, you know, prevent these derivative suits and that sort of thing, a company's duty of care is degree of reasonable care. So if you know that you have all these, now that data breach is out there, now that there's all this information out there, it's going to be harder and harder for companies to put their head in the sand and say, well, I just didn't know. I didn't know that was an issue.
So we've given you two different kinds of an event, one that's more of a personal event and one that's more of a corporate event. Both of those are good examples of data breach you see on the screen in front of you. And we've already defined the terms that are listed. But let's focus just on what the causes are for a minute.
Yeah, so there's usually three three main reasons, and then there's some acronyms that'll help you. But one's a criminal attack, the system glitch, and the human error. And so if you, the criminal attack, you know, what I've heard is MICE, you know, money, intelligence, coercion, ego, and they've added a new one, R for retaliation, where disgruntled employees are just going back. And that actually, they said that was one of the reasons for the Sony breach, because remember they stole the movie, but the big item that came out of there were all the internal emails that made senior management look foolish. And that was really the cause of that. But if you look at, and this just, if you go to any theft or any fraud, you know, these are the type of things that somebody will do to perpetrate that.
So MICE is a fraud term.
MICE has been around, yes, for a long time. And it's been, and so as data breach has grown, it's been the term that the industry has used to discuss the motivations for data breach.
So if you have in your organization an expert on fraud, that's somebody that should be a part of your team in designing your plan and working in this area.
Absolutely. You would. There's a number of people, and we'll go over that in a minute. The other item I had on there was a glitch. So what's a glitch? You know, the accidental disclosure and release of data. And that's occurred before, and that's happened recently. Or the unintended access into third parties. And you saw that through Home Depot and Target. And, you know, monitoring controls are vital for those. But the systems that are out there, and the myriad of systems, will give a door to somebody. And I have the name Fazio there. And a lot of people don't know of Fazio Mechanical. Fazio Mechanical was the way that the breach happened in Target. They actually went into Fazio Mechanical, who had all the, I think, refrigeration and HVAC repair for Target, and actually then got into Target through Fazio. And so Fazio is a small company in Pennsylvania, you know, and they probably thought, we will never be breached, just like, actually not the people on this call, the people who aren't on this call.
Yeah.
Believe that they won't be breached, and so they don't think it's something that's going to happen.
And Fazio was thinking they didn't have anything that would be of importance, so we're not a high-profile target.
Right. I was at a client, and we were doing the planning session for this breach, and the CEO came in, and he said, you know, he asked the CFO and legal what we were doing, and we said we're going to run a breach scenario, and he said, oh, did I tell you guys that the Secret Service came here last month? And, you know, head of legal looks up and said, no, you didn't. He goes, yeah, they said that our servers have been under attack for 3 days and wanted to know what we did that made it so that somebody wanted into us. Now, this was a distributor of maintenance, repair, operating, production supplies, the consumables and manufacturing. They were online with their major customers, who were Boeing, Raytheon, Ford, you know, large aerospace, large defense, large contractors. And so whoever was after them as a gateway into their customers. And it was interesting that the CEO had not told other key members of management. He did tell IT, though.
That's good. You know, I think if the Secret Service or the FBI arrives at your office, that's good. By the way, everybody on today's call is guilty of the glitch. How many times have you ever sent an email to the wrong person because you've got a contact file, and instead of hitting the right person, you get the other person, and that information went that way?
You mean this week?
I think so. All right, so think about the diagnostic model just for a second.
Yeah, so if you think about the diagnostic model, which if you've been on other calls, you know that this really will model any crisis, any business crisis. But if you look at the data breach specifically, it actually starts off in the lower left-hand corner as the difficult crisis. And that's because you have bad processes in place, and, you know, things haven't gotten bad, but you're actually susceptible to them, but you haven't told people what to do. Now, it'll move across to the right-hand side, over to the chronic side, as the breach actually begins to occur. And depending on what they have access to and how long it goes on for, it'll move into the upper right-hand quadrant. Now, the upper right-hand quadrant is where you lose control over your business. The lower right-hand quadrant is where you have a lot of business problems that you have to bring multiple resources to bear to resolve them. So Fazio Mechanical, as the company they've broken into to get to Target, they were probably up in the severe area, because all of a sudden now a small little company has FBI, they have Federal Trade Commission, they have all these people now in their little organization, and it brought them, obviously, they had to respond to that. Other organizations, they don't get up that far, but it could hurt their reputation. So it's basically a process that you look at, and it affects the operational, structural, functional processes. So structural design, again, is how you communicate within the organization. Management, board of directors. When does the board want to be notified for a breach? What type of breach does the board want to be notified to? Now, it's interesting when we sit down with senior management, they tell us, so this is when the board wants to be notified. And we simply ask, have you asked the board? And most of the times they haven't asked the board. My recommendation is ask your board when they want to be notified. Ask your lawyers when they want to be notified. That gets into your operational. Operational crisis is how the different functions work. So if they, can you make sales? Is your web portal down? If Amazon's web portals went down, that would have a significant operational crisis. Or if they couldn't ship to the distributors, or if they couldn't talk to their suppliers. If you think of all the ways that we communicate versus IT, and a lot of times when the problem is found, they shut everything down. If you remember, Sony shut down everything, I think, for at least a week. And then systems started coming up slowly, one at a time, piecemeal. And they slowly got back to normal. And then functional is how you operate within the process. So IT is clearly a function. They're the ones that get put under the bright light. But finance, sales, accounting, and all those are functional. But it's a people, profitability, brand, reputational issue. And the one thing about data breach is it actually impacts all of these. This is one of those crises that permeates every piece of the business.
Well, it's good, though, because we know that a data breach, everything's going to move slowly.
That's right. So why do you want to be prepared? So and here's the chronology for Target. Day 3, the Federal Trade Commission. Day 4, 3 class action suits. Day 5, 15 class action suits. Day 8, 30 class action suits. In the first 90 days, management had to go and testify before Congress. Now, I have never testified before Senate. I've never done that, but I imagine there's a whole bunch of prep work that goes into that. And then, as you all know, the CEO and CIO either resigned or were terminated. So within the first 90 days, and I think the final breach was 60 million cards. I think that was their final number that they knew.
So things move quickly. If you're not prepared, if you don't have your messaging, if you don't have your decision processes identified, this thing is going to actually move at the speed of light. So when we talk about this, there are indicators. Let's talk about some of these indicators.
So as you know, the indicators, that cue or clue, that item that comes about, that's, sometimes somebody says something to you and they're not telling you the truth, or you see something that doesn't make sense to you. It's the see something, say something mentality. I wrote down some of these data breach indicators.
Well, and Jack had shared he'd just seen Jeff Foxworthy, you're a redneck if. And I think you've got a data breach if your system runs slower than normal. You've got a data breach if your emergency request would circumvent normal protocol to release information. You've got a data breach if you've had large data transfers from non-routine associates. You've got a data breach if you've got multiple portals for suppliers and customers. You've got a data breach if you have non-segregated point of purchase programs. And you've got a data breach if social media disclosures of leaked information. If you see your information out on the network, out on the internet, it had to come from somewhere. These are all indicators, and if you're looking for them, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about an intelligence network to start to identify that, but that's where you start to see the potential for a business crisis risk.
Yeah, the emergency request one, that's a scam that's been out there where it says the CEO is at a conference, he just ran into a big supplier and found out we owed him money, and please wire them this money right away. And they get it off social media. They're looking for Twitters, and the CEO says, I'm here. That happened to a client of ours, and it was remarkable. They knew the CEO's first name. They knew the contact of the supplier's first name. They knew a person in Treasury, and they forged the email, and this company had a very long name. The longer your domain, the more likely you are you're going to get this. And it just put an extra letter in there. Actually, I got an email from Wells Fargo's the other day, so, I guess you don't need a real long name, but They actually, and the only thing that prevented it was the person who received the email for the wire transfer wasn't authorized to wire transfer it. And she shot the email back saying, you know I can't do this. And that's what started it. And had they gotten the right person, that money would have been gone.
So as we think about this, let's talk about the stages of going about and developing a plan.
Yeah, so this is just a broad overview. The first is to conduct a business crisis risk audit. Well, in this case, we know what our item is. We know that we want to talk about data breach. And you put a cross-functional team in the room. And in the initial meeting, the CEO, CFO, CIO are in the room, but also legal, finance, sales, your purchasing. Every major functional group is in the room, because if you have a data breach, it will, in one way or another, impact everybody, HR. Then the second stage, of course, you start looking down at the different types of data breach, because we've talked about different types of data. Well, the impact in the business is different. And so we start drawing up the matrix of all the different types of breaches and what the impact is to that business. And in this, it's more the frontline managers. Those folks who have to deal with the crisis are the ones that are going through it. And then you develop the detailed strategies, which includes your messaging statements. So if it's this type of data breach, who do we talk to? So let's just say our protected healthcare information is stolen on our employees. Okay, well, and it shows up on the internet. What are our messaging statements? Who do we do? What do we, from a tactical, what do we do? When do we call law enforcement? Have we identified third-party people that can come in and help us? Because most companies will overwrite their systems trying to fix a data breach and make prosecution and detection impossible. So have you identified that third party today that's going to come in and help you in this, and they're going to tell you not to touch anything? And then what's our position with law enforcement? Because law enforcement, the FBI and major data breaches they want the breach to continue. They want to see who it is, what they're after, because you might just be a stepping stone in a bigger investigation. So all these things, and you work out those strategies, and then you learn from it, and then we talk about the containment and resolving, and then and then the hot wash and learning from the process as it occurs.
So another quote: if you don't have a business continuity plan or a business interruption plan, you have no chance of formulating a cyber threat assessment plan. There's a question mark there, and I think it's a question mark in organizations of how those things get integrated together.
Yeah, you can't combat it if you haven't done these other basic steps. If you don't know, because it plugs into the existing plan.
You can't build the second floor until you build the first floor.
That's right.
So what's foreseeable? Today we're in an environment where everything is foreseeable, and tomorrow anyone may be held accountable. And that's so doubly true in this area, because we're on notice. We're on notice from the government. We're on notice from the regulators. We're on notice from every industry segment. We see the cyber risk is there, the data breach that follows quickly along. Creating an intelligence network to take this information that you're seeing and converting it into useful information. You need an intelligence network so that you can have long-term stability, and it gives you that perspective as you go forward. So when we talk about an intelligence network, our goal is to know today what will happen tomorrow. And it comes back to that predict, and that's what we're doing. We're taking that information in, converting it into predictive, actionable intelligence, having a plan in place to deal with it so that we can execute. The uncertainty, the confusion that's around this, we want to transform that to certainty. It's not a matter of if we're going to have this problem. It's a matter of when we're going to have this problem. And then what are the metrics? How are we going to know if we did a good job? How do we know if suddenly things are starting to happen? That's a key indicator for us. So we've got to define the framework, identify the risks that are involved, and manage and mitigate those risks. There are a lot of questions that can be raised in each one of those elements, and today we're not going to be going through those and looking at them, but you can start to see that it's more than just turning this over to the IT department and forgetting about it and focusing in on that. If we were going to take some portions of this intelligence network and break them down into some elements, it'd be listening for the threats. We think about this, about listening and looking when we talk about intelligence network, looking for streams, for phrases, for words that are being done, getting the alerts and the reports that we're able to do that we can start to map the uses of these phrases and words, and those will be key indicators for us.
Is this hard to do?
If you call us, it's not so hard. No. The answer is yes, because it's depending upon the name of your company. If the more generic your name is, if you're the the base company, well, that's a base is a common word. It'd be easy to be found. If you have a unique name, that's a little bit easier for us to structure it. But identifying what those phrases are, what those streams are of words that are coming together. A stream is made up of phrases. Phrases are made up of words, become important. The other aspect is putting a geofence around the property, looking at everything that's being sent in and out and all the messages and communications, having a risk rating capability, and then finally a time machine to be able to go back in time and say, what was this person doing last week or the week before? How do we measure that and put it together?
Can't we also look within the dark web? If somebody has an intellectual property and do a search to see whether or not that IP is out there, as long as we have a copy of that document?
Yeah, there are specific tools, and that's a much more advanced intelligence network. I was on the phone with a group out of London a couple of weeks ago, and they specialize in the dark web. In the dark web, where the criminals are going to go. If we go back into the real world for a minute and we think a fence. A fence is, I just stole this piece of jewelry, I'm going to sell it to the fence, and the fence is going to get it out to someone else. The dark web is the place that you would go to sell this information. If suddenly the specific language in your key crown jewels intellectual property starts appearing out on the internet, wouldn't you want to know who's using that and coming in together? It's like the space shuttle design that you talked about a little bit later. So speaking of that, I think it's time to talk about rocket scientists.
Yeah, so the head of Missile Defense Cybersecurity gave this quote: they literally works with rocket scientists and can't get them to stop clicking the wrong links. So what chance does your organization have? And he was serious. He said, you know, I work with some of the smartest people on the planet, and they'll still click on your DHL package was delivered. He says that all of their laptops that are used, he said most are not allowed to leave the facility, but they still scrub them. They'll leave them on, they'll image them at night and scrub them just because, and they find daily that somebody's done something like that.
So what should you know? First, recognize that this isn't just an IT problem. So we didn't invite just CIOs to be on our call today. Know what your data you have, who would want it, how to protect it, and what to do if you lose it. Be prepared. You cannot not have a plan for this. If you had a business today in California and not having an earthquake plan, wouldn't make much sense to me. If you have a business that doesn't use laptops, that doesn't use computers, doesn't use smartphones, doesn't use tablets, doesn't speak over a phone, you know what? You probably don't need a cyber program. But if you do use any of those things, and as we move more and more of our information to the cloud, the vulnerabilities are going to escalate exponentially. Train your organization to recognize those indicators of a breach.
You know, we put 5 on there. I think the last count there were almost 100.
There you go.
Indicators.
And test your plans. Test your plans. I'm going one more time. Test your plans. If you haven't tested this and tested your response capabilities, you have no idea of what's going to happen. And you must have this intelligence network. So next steps, are you and your organization prepared for a cyber risk, for a data breach event? If you can't answer that, absolutely. We did a survey yesterday of 300 or 400, 500 people that were attending a thing about where they prepared for a violence scenario, and over half said they weren't. And so today, we didn't ask that question of everybody who registered for today's webinar, but I think you would find that most people would answer they aren't. But can you afford not to be? Test your response plan with cyber risk, a data breach simulation. Go through and say, we just lost this. What do we do? How does this come about? Give them the indicators and the exercises, just as you would on any exercise that you would be conducting a tabletop event, and see how your people recognize it and how it responds. I was fortunate enough to sit in an exercise last month with an insurance company, public insurance company. We went through what would be occurring at each element, how they knew, how they would respond, and what they would do.
And it's escalating. You know, half of what you learn in the beginning of every crisis is wrong. You just don't know which half.
There you go. So assess what your information is, look at your current plans, create an intelligence network. If you would have some questions, you can send us those at firestorm.com, by going to our website. You can send us an email at webinars@Firestorm, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. We had a lot of questions that appeared on the little panel on the right. We're going to try to reach out to everyone in today's call individually and see if we can answer those. But unfortunately, cyber risk and data breach are a fact of life for all of us today. If you have any questions, this is an area that you can make a difference within your organization by being the person that starts to lead the charge. We need to put these things in place. We'll follow up. There will be a brief on today's webinar that will be available shortly. If you would like to get a copy of the recording, let us know, and we can share that with you. Thank you again, and good luck this week. And by the way, if you have any of my data, don't release it. Have a good day. Bye.